May 1945. As Allied forces sweep across Germany, they discover something unprecedented: a fully operational rocket program capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. Underground factories hold thousands of components. Launch sites dot the countryside, and in hidden facilities, engineers possess knowledge a decade ahead of anything the Allies have achieved. The V-2 rocket, Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeance weapon, is about to spark a new kind of race, one that will reach far beyond Earth's atmosphere. In early May 1945, as Germany collapsed, the V-2 program represented the most advanced rocket technology in the world. From September 1944 until March 1945, more than 3,000 V-2 rockets had been launched against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. Each missile stood 46 feet tall, weighed 27,000 pounds when fueled, and could deliver a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles at supersonic speed. No defense existed against them. By the time of Germany's surrender on May 8th, V-2 production had ceased, but the infrastructure remained largely intact. The Mittelwerk factory complex, buried deep in the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen, contained partially assembled rockets, complete missiles ready for launch, and warehouses full of components. At Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, where the V-2 had been developed, test facilities and technical archives held the accumulated research of over a decade. Allied intelligence had been tracking the V-2 program for years, but the full scope of German achievements surprised even informed observers. The rockets discovered in May 1945 were not experimental prototypes, but production weapons that had been manufactured by the thousands. The industrial capacity to build them, the mathematical calculations needed to guide them, and the metallurgical knowledge required to construct engines that could withstand extreme temperatures represented revolutionary advances. Unlike tanks or aircraft that existed in other nations' arsenals, rockets of this capability existed nowhere else. The United States had primitive rocket research programs. Britain had conducted limited experiments. The Soviet Union had theoretical work but no operational missiles. Germany's V-2 represented a technology gap measured not in months or years but potentially in decades. As Allied armies advanced, three powers raced to seize everything they could: the missiles themselves, the manufacturing equipment, the technical documentation, and most valuable of all, the scientists and engineers who had created them. The competition that began in May 1945 would shape the space age and define Cold War military strategy for the next 40 years. Within days of Germany's surrender, American forces launched Operation Paperclip, an intelligence operation that would become one of the most consequential technology transfers in history. On May 2, 1945, even before the formal capitulation, American troops from the 3rd Armored Division reached Nordhausen and secured the Mittelwerk factory. What they found stunned them. Tunnels extending for miles into the mountains contained complete V-2 assembly lines. Rail cars held finished rockets. Storage chambers were stacked with engines, guidance systems, fuel pumps, and tens of thousands of components. Major James Hamill, leading the initial American survey, estimated that enough parts existed to assemble at least 100 complete V-2 rockets, possibly more. The United States moved with remarkable speed. Colonel Holger Toftoy of Army Ordnance received authorization to seize everything before Soviet forces arrived. The demarcation line establishing Soviet and American occupation zones placed Nordhausen in what would become Soviet territory, but the formal handover was scheduled for weeks later. Toftoy had a narrow window. Working around the clock, American troops and hired German workers loaded V-2 components onto 341 rail cars. They stripped the Mittelwerk factory systematically, taking complete rockets, spare parts, production equipment, technical drawings, and testing apparatus. The operation required careful documentation to ensure that components from different systems would match when reassembled in America. Everything was cataloged, crated, and shipped west to Antwerp, then loaded onto Liberty ships bound for New Orleans. By early June, before Soviet forces arrived to occupy the region, the Americans had removed approximately 100 complete V-2 rockets worth of components, along with vital production machinery and documentation. When Soviet troops entered Nordhausen on July 5, 1945, they found empty tunnels and missing equipment. The most advanced rocket technology in existence was already crossing the Atlantic. But hardware alone was insufficient. The Americans also pursued the scientists. Werner von Braun, technical director of the V-2 program, had already surrendered to American forces in May, along with over 100 key engineers and scientists. Von Braun understood that rocket research would continue after the war, and he chose the Americans over the Soviets or the British. He and his team were initially held in Bavaria, then gradually brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. The British had their own operation, codenamed Backfire. Unlike the Americans who focused on seizing hardware and personnel, the British wanted to understand how to operate V-2 rockets. At Cuxhaven in northern Germany, British forces assembled a temporary launch site using captured equipment and employed German technicians to prepare missiles for test flights. In October 1945, the British successfully launched 3 V-2 rockets from Cuxhaven, with Allied observers from multiple nations watching. The tests proved that the rockets could be operated by teams trained through German documentation and that the technology was reproducible. British scientists documented every aspect of the launches, from fuel mixing to guidance system calibration. These tests provided valuable intelligence, but Britain lacked the resources to pursue large-scale rocket development in the immediate post-war period. The British also captured significant technical personnel, though fewer than the Americans. Some German engineers were brought to Britain for interrogation and short-term employment, helping British scientists understand rocket propulsion, guidance systems, and structural design. However, Britain's primary post-war focus was on jet engines and nuclear weapons, not rockets, and most German rocket scientists in British custody were eventually released or transferred to American control. The Soviet Union arrived late to Nordhausen, but moved aggressively to secure what remained. Finding the factories stripped, Soviet trophy brigades expanded their search across the Soviet occupation zone. At Peenemünde, at smaller production facilities, and at scattered test sites, they gathered whatever the Americans had missed or overlooked. More importantly, the Soviets captured thousands of German technicians, engineers, and workers who had been involved in V-2 production. Unlike the Americans, who selectively recruited top scientists, the Soviets took everyone with relevant knowledge, sometimes including entire families. These personnel were transported east, many to the Soviet Union itself, where they were employed in recreating V-2 technology and training Soviet engineers. At facilities near Moscow and later at Kapustin Yar in Kazakhstan, German specialists worked under Soviet direction to assemble V-2 rockets from captured components and to manufacture new examples based on German designs. The Soviets methodically extracted knowledge from their German workers, documenting processes, training Soviet counterparts, and establishing an indigenous rocket program. Stalin recognized that rocket technology would be crucial for future military power. Soviet engineers like Korolev, who would later design the first intercontinental ballistic missile and launch the first satellite, learned directly from German V-2 technology. The Soviets tested their first reconstructed V-2, designated R-1, in October 1947. By the late 1940s, Soviet rocket development had absorbed German knowledge and begun to move beyond it. Competition among the Allies created tensions from the start. Each power wanted exclusive access to the best technology and the most knowledgeable scientists. The Americans' rapid seizure of Nordhausen before Soviet arrival caused diplomatic friction. The Soviets' mass deportation of German specialists raised ethical questions, even in the context of post-war justice. The British felt they had contributed intelligence about the V-2 program, but received less technology than the Americans or Soviets. By 1946, the initial scramble was complete. The United States had the most complete collection of V-2 hardware and the leading scientists. The Soviet Union had successfully recreated V-2 capability using captured components and personnel. Britain had gained knowledge through the backfire tests, but was withdrawing from direct rocket development. The stage was set for these captured German rockets to transform into something far larger, the missiles and space programs of the Cold War. Once secured in the United States, captured V-2 rockets became the foundation of American rocket research. The components shipped from Germany were transported to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where Army engineers began the painstaking process of reassembling complete missiles from mixed components. Wernher von Braun and his team of German scientists, now working under American military supervision, guided the effort. They trained American engineers in V-2 assembly, explained the function of each system, and supervised initial test launches. The first American launch of a captured V-2 took place on April 16, 1946 at White Sands. The rocket reached an altitude of over 3 miles before tumbling and crashing. Subsequent launches were more successful. Between 1946 and 1952, the United States launched approximately 70 V-2 rockets at White Sands. These were not military exercises, but scientific experiments. Each rocket carried instruments instead of warheads: cameras to photograph Earth from high altitude, cosmic ray detectors, temperature and pressure sensors, and later biological specimens, including plants, seeds, and even small animals. The V-2 became America's first tool for space research. The flights provided unprecedented data. Scientists observed atmospheric conditions above 100 kilometers for the first time. They photographed Earth's curvature from altitudes the V-2 could reach. They measured solar radiation unfiltered by the atmosphere. Each launch taught American engineers more about rocket design, guidance systems, and the challenges of high-altitude flight. American researchers also modified the V-2 design. They added improved guidance systems, tested new fuel combinations, and experimented with multi-stage configurations. The WAC Corporal, a smaller American rocket, was mounted atop a V-2 in 1949, creating a 2-stage vehicle that reached an altitude of 244 miles, a record that stood for years. These experiments directly informed American missile development, leading to weapons like the Redstone rocket and eventually to the launch vehicles that would carry satellites and astronauts into space. The Germans working in America faced complex circumstances. Von Braun and his colleagues were former members of the Nazi Party and the SS, and the V-2 program had relied on slave labor from concentration camps, resulting in thousands of deaths. Operation Paperclip involved classified decisions to overlook these histories in favor of securing technical expertise. The German scientists were initially kept under military supervision, their movements restricted and their work classified. Over time, restrictions eased. German scientists became naturalized American citizens, moved from military bases into civilian communities, and eventually led major programs at NASA. Von Braun became a public figure, appearing on television and in magazines as America's leading rocket expert. The moral complexities of this transition remain controversial among historians. In the Soviet Union, the captured V-2 technology followed a different path. Soviet engineers led by Sergei Korolev used German rockets as learning tools and moved quickly toward indigenous designs. The R-1, essentially a Soviet-built V-2, was followed by the R-2, which had greater range, and then the R-5, which could carry a nuclear warhead. Unlike the Americans, who used V-2 for science, the Soviets focused entirely on military applications. Their goal was to develop ballistic missiles capable of striking Western Europe, and eventually the United States. The German specialists brought to the Soviet Union trained Soviet engineers until their knowledge was fully transferred. Most were allowed to return to Germany by the early 1950s. Soviet rocket development accelerated through the 1950s, culminating in the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. This rocket, a direct descendant of German V-2 technology filtered through Soviet improvements, launched Sputnik in 1957, and it carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961. The space race, in essence, began with components seized from Nordhausen in 1945. The British took a more measured approach. After the backfire tests, Britain collaborated with the United States, sharing data and occasionally participating in American launches. British scientists contributed to theoretical work and guidance system development, but Britain focused its limited post-war resources on nuclear weapons and jet aircraft rather than rockets. It would be decades before Britain developed independent launch capability. By the early 1950s, the original captured V-2 rockets were exhausted. The last components from Nordhausen had been used, and the remaining German-built missiles were either expended in tests or placed in museums. But the V-2 legacy had taken root. American and Soviet rocket programs had grown from German foundations into independent research establishments, pursuing far more ambitious goals than Hitler's engineers had imagined. As the captured V-2 rockets were consumed in testing, the question arose of what to do with the remaining artifacts. Unlike tanks or aircraft that could be preserved relatively easily, V-2 rockets posed unique challenges. They were large, fragile, and contained no fuel or explosive components once decommissioned. Museums across the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union began acquiring examples for display. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington received one of the first V-2s preserved for public exhibition. The rocket, suspended in the museum's main hall, became an immediate attraction, drawing visitors curious about the weapon that had terrorized London and the technology that might reach space. Similar displays appeared at military museums, Air Force bases, and science centers across the United States. In Britain, the Imperial War Museum obtained a V-2 for display, emphasizing its role as the terror weapon that had killed over 2,700 people in London between 1944 and 1945. British exhibitions tended to present the V-2 in the context of the war, focusing on its impact as a weapon and the civilian casualties it caused. The technical achievement was acknowledged but balanced against the human cost. Soviet museums took a different approach, presenting captured V-2s as trophies of victory and as stepping stones to Soviet rocket supremacy. Displays emphasized how Soviet engineers had mastered and surpassed German technology. By the 1960s, as Soviet space achievements mounted, the V-2 was presented as the primitive ancestor of superior Soviet designs. Very few complete original V-2 rockets survived into the modern era. Most of the missiles captured in 1945 were launched and destroyed in tests. Others were disassembled for study, their components scattered across research facilities. A small number of rockets were preserved intact, becoming historically significant artifacts as the years passed and their rarity increased. The preservation challenges were significant. V-2 rockets were constructed primarily of thin aluminum and steel, materials that corroded over time. The guidance systems contained delicate instruments that deteriorated without proper storage. Liquid fuel residues left corrosive deposits inside tanks and fuel lines. Museums that acquired V-2s faced ongoing conservation work to prevent further degradation. Some V-2 artifacts survived in unexpected places. In the 1990s, V-2 components were discovered at former launch sites in France and the Netherlands, buried where they had been abandoned in 1945. Crash sites across England yielded fragments of missiles that had malfunctioned or been shot down during the war. Collectors and researchers sought these remains, preserving them as historical evidence. The most complete surviving V-2 rockets today reside at major museums: the Smithsonian in Washington, the Science Museum in London, the Deutsches Museum in Munich, and the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. Each represents not just a single rocket, but the entire V-2 program and the technological revolution it sparked. These artifacts are studied by aerospace historians, engineers, and students learning about the origins of space exploration. The legacy of the V-2 extends beyond the physical rockets. Technical documents captured in 1945 influenced rocket design for decades. Wind tunnel data, propulsion calculations, guidance system schematics, and metallurgical research informed American and Soviet programs throughout the Cold War. Many aerospace engineers working in the 1960s and the 1970s learned their profession by studying V-2 documentation. The German scientists who had built the V-2 left a complicated legacy. Their work led directly to the Apollo program, communication satellites, weather forecasting, and GPS navigation. But the V-2 had been built by slave laborers under horrific conditions, and the scientists who benefited from Operation Paperclip avoided accountability for their roles in those atrocities. This moral tension remains unresolved in historical discussions of the V-2 program. By the 1970s, as the Apollo program ended and the space shuttle era began, the V-2 was recognized as a historical milestone. Universities, aerospace companies, and research institutions sought V-2 components for teaching and display. The rockets that had once been cutting-edge weapons had become museum pieces, symbols of how rapidly technology could advance and how wartime innovations could transform into peaceful applications. The story of the V-2 after 1945 is unique among German weapons. While Tigers and Bf-109s were largely destroyed or scrapped, the V-2 was actively cultivated, its technology nurtured and expanded. The rockets seized in May 1945 did not end a weapons program. They began a new era. Every satellite launched, every spacecraft sent to other planets, and every crewed mission into orbit traces its lineage back to the German engineers who designed the V-2 and to the Allied intelligence officers who recognized that these rockets were too valuable to destroy. What happened to the V-2 rockets after World War II was not merely a story of capture or disposal. It was the beginning of the space age, triggered by the rush to seize German technology in the final days of the Third Reich. The underground factories of Nordhausen, once symbols of Nazi terror, became the unexpected birthplace of humanity's reach beyond Earth. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to German U-boats after World War II next. It explores how the U-boat fleet was captured, studied, and scattered across the world in the aftermath of the war. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.